My name is Clara. I'm 32 years old, and I have spent my entire life living in the shadow of my older sister, Helena. This enormous mansion used to be our home, the place where I was born, where my parents raised us, and now the place where they were hosting their 50th wedding anniversary. I came back after years of distance, not because I wanted to, but because my father had called and asked me to come. He said he wanted the whole family together, at least one last time. But the moment I stepped through the iron gates of the estate, I knew I had made a mistake. My dress was not expensive enough. The car I drove was not flashy enough. And Helena, my older sister, was standing there with a smile. I knew too well the smile she wore whenever she was about to do something cruel. "Clara, there you are," she said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "I didn't think you'd actually show up. After all, people like you aren't usually welcome in places like this." A few people laughed under their breath. My mother, Margaret, stood beside Helena and nodded, as if what she had said was simply an obvious truth. "You've done less than nothing this past year," my mother said, her voice full of contempt. "The best thing you can do is not disappoint your father on his important day." I stood there, feeling hundreds of eyes turn toward me, and I remembered exactly why I had left this house as soon as I could. My father had once been a successful businessman, but in his later years, he had struggled. The debts piled up. The bank had threatened to foreclose on the mansion. Helena had lived in that house as if it belonged to her, but she had done nothing to save it. I had. For the past 3 years, I had worked relentlessly building my own business, saving every dollar, and finally buying the mansion back from the bank before my family lost it forever. But no one in my family knew that. They did not know because I had not told them. I had learned that telling them the truth only gave them new ways to hurt me. They would not believe me. Or worse, they would believe me and still criticize me for daring to do something they could not. My father, weak and sickly in recent years. I did not recognize me at first when I stepped into the living room. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, looking out over the garden with clouded eyes. I walked over to him and took his hand. "Dad, I'm home." He looked at me with a faint smile. "Clara, my girl, I'm glad you came." He did not see the cold looks Helena and my mother were giving me. He did not know I had been humiliated on the front steps before I even walked inside. I looked around the room I used to call home. Everything was exactly as I remembered: the dark wooden furniture, the oil paintings on the walls, the marble fireplace. But now, I no longer felt like I belonged to any of it. I was an outsider inside my own house, and I knew this evening was not going to end the way they expected. Helena was the one leading the celebration. She stood before the crowd and told stories about our childhood. But every story was shaped to make her shine and make me look smaller. "Clara was always the child who hid in her room with books," she said as people laughed. "I suppose she hasn't changed much since then, still living in her own little world. Still not very practical." My mother nodded along. They knew I could not answer back in front of everyone without ruining my father's evening. They had turned my kindness into a weapon against me. After dinner, I stepped out into the garden for some air. I had been in that living room too long, and it was starting to feel like it was closing around my throat. Helena followed me outside with a glass of wine in her hand. "You know, Clara," she said, her voice sweet as poison, "I actually think you did the right thing by staying away from this family. We don't need people who drag us down." I said nothing. I just looked out at the garden sinking into darkness. "You never belonged here," Helena continued. "Do you really think you can just show up and Dad will forget all the years you weren't around? It doesn't work that way." Finally, I said, "Dad called me. He asked me to come." Helena laughed. "Dad doesn't know what he's saying half the time." At his age, he can barely remember what day it is. I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt myself struggling to hold back my anger. Helena thought Dad was weak and incapable of making decisions. She had no idea he had signed the papers selling the mansion to me when I asked, because I was the only one who had still believed in him. "Let's go back inside," Helena said. "It's getting cold. You'll make everyone worry." I stayed outside for a long moment in the dark, staring at the light spilling from the mansion's tall windows. It was my house now, and I was not going to let anyone drive me out of it. When I returned inside, Helena was standing beside my mother, both of them dressed in expensive gowns and glittering jewelry beneath the crystal lights. The guests had gathered around the small platform where Helena was about to speak. I stood near the back, close to the doorway, trying not to draw attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Helena began, her voice full of confidence, "thank you all for coming to share this important moment with our family." Everyone applauded. Helena looked toward my father, who was sitting in his chair with a faint smile. My father spent his entire life building this legacy. This house, this estate. Everything you see here is the result of his sacrifice and vision. She paused and looked toward me. I could see the spark in her eyes. She was about to do something, but not everyone in this family has valued that, Helena said, her voice still sweet, but edged underneath. "Some people chose to leave us. Some people chose to live their own way, as if family meant nothing." My mother nodded, encouraging her. "My sister Clara is a perfect example. She left this house years ago and barely came back. Today, she showed up, and I'm glad she did. But I wonder if she truly understands the value of what our father built." A few soft laughs moved through the crowd. They thought it was just a gentle joke between sisters. But I knew the truth. Helena was trying to shame me in front of everyone. I stood still and said nothing. I had been too used to this to react. But this time, something inside me was beginning to boil. "Clara," Helena said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Do you have anything you'd like to say to everyone? Maybe you can explain why you disappeared for years." Every pair of eyes turned toward me. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face calm. I left because I needed to build a life of my own. I said, my voice steady. I couldn't keep living in this family's shadow and hoping things would magically get better. I had to create something for myself. Helena laughed. "Create something? What do you do?" "Clara work in some tiny office for minimum wage. Live in a cramped little rental." The guests started whispering. A few people laughed under their breath. But others looked at Helena with visible discomfort, and Mainin, "At least I'm not living off our parents," I said, still calm. "And I don't need to tear other people down, just to feel taller." The air in the room tightened. My mother stepped forward, anger bright in her eyes. "Clara, that's enough. You did not come here to ruin your father's evening." "Mother," I said, turning to her, "I'm not ruining anything. I'm defending myself, something I should have done years ago." My father, sitting in his chair, looked at me with confused eyes. He did not understand what was happening, but I knew I needed to end this. Helena moved closer to me, her voice thick with venom. "You know, Clara, maybe you should use the servants' entrance when you leave. It's out back by the garage. Very convenient. And that way you won't ruin the mood of the evening." She said it loudly enough for the nearby guests to hear, and several people laughed out loud. My mother laughed with them. I looked into Helena's eyes and felt something shift inside me. That was the moment I decided I was not going to let her get away with this. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice strangely calm. Helena smirked. "If you have something to say, say it." I turned toward the room. and I could see the curiosity in everyone's faces. They were waiting for something. "I want to thank all of you for coming tonight," I said, my voice carrying through the room. "And I want to announce something many of you may not know. This house, this estate, everything you see here, it no longer belongs to my family." A few people in the room looked confused. "It belongs to me," I said, still calm. "I bought it from the bank 3 months ago." Silence fell over the room. I could hear people breathing, glasses shifting in nervous hands. Helena's face went pale, and my mother's mouth fell open. "That's a lie," Helena finally said, her voice rough. "That's impossible. You don't have enough money to buy this place." "Really?" "Helena," I said, looking at her with the gaze I had been holding back for years. "I worked nonstop. I built my business from the ground up. I didn't sit here hoping someone else would save me." My mother stepped forward, fear replacing her anger. "Clara, you can't do this. This is our home. Your father built it. It stopped being our home when the bank prepared to take it." I said, "And neither of you did anything. I saved it." I looked at Helena, and she was standing frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. She could not believe I had done this without her knowing. "But you had no right," Helena said, her voice shaking. "Dad said this house would be mine. He said that. Dad didn't have the right to decide that anymore." I said, "He no longer owned it. The bank had taken control, and the person who saved it was me." I looked around the room. Some guests had started shifting uncomfortably. Others were staring at Helena with open curiosity. "You didn't have to do this in front of everyone," Helena said, her arrogance fading from her voice. "We can talk about this privately." "No, Helena," I said. "You've treated me this way in front of people for years. Now they get to hear the truth in front of people too." I looked toward my father, who was still sitting with a confused expression. He was not entirely sure what was happening, but he could feel the tension in the room. "I didn't just buy this house," I said, turning back to Helena. "I paid off our parents' debts. I paid Dad's medical bills. I paid the rent on the apartment you lived in for the last 3 years. I kept this family standing. And none of you knew it." A voice from the back spoke up. "Is that true?" "Clara," I turned and saw a woman watching me with curiosity and disbelief. "Yes?" I said. I did it quietly because I didn't need anyone's applause to know I was doing the right thing. Helena stood frozen, unable to speak. My mother looked down at the floor, unable to face me. I felt something inside me change. For the first time in years, I had told the truth. And now I was going to walk through the front door as the owner of this house, Arthur. I called out, "Please bring me the key." Arthur, the butler who had served our family for more than 30 years, stepped out from the back. He bowed his head and handed me a large key. "Miss Clara, would you like to keep this key as a reminder of today? Thank you." "Arthur," I said, closing my hand around it. "But it's only a keepsake. This house, and everything in it, belongs to me." I looked at Helena and my mother, and for the first time, they had nothing to say. But I knew this fight was not over. Helena would not give up easily. I could see it in her eyes, a cold spark. A new calculation. She was already thinking about how to take control back. And I knew I had to be ready for anything. But tonight, I had won one important battle. I had stood up and told the truth. I had taken back my house. And no one could take that from me. The room remained silent as I held the key tightly in my hand. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me. But for the first time in my life, I did not feel the urge to look away. I had spent too many years staying quiet, accepting the role of the insignificant younger sister, letting Helena and my mother define who I was. But tonight, everything had changed. "Arthur," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "Would you please bring me the brown briefcase from my desk? It's labeled Estate Records." Arthur bowed his head and disappeared through the back door. My mother stepped forward, her face pale and her eyes full of panic. "Clara, you can't do this. This is not how family matters should be handled." "Mother," I said, calm but firm, "I have let you and Helena treat me like this for years." You stood there and nodded while Helena called me a servant and pointed me toward the back entrance. "Did you really think I would just stand still and stay silent forever?" My mother looked down at the floor, her hands trembling. Helena stepped forward, trying to recover the confidence she had lost. "Clara, you don't understand. I protected this family while you were off doing whatever shady little things you were doing. You can't just show up and claim everything." "Claim," I repeated, I hardly believing what I had just heard. "I'm not claiming anything. Helena, I bought this house with my own money. I paid every dollar of our parents' debts. I saved this family while you sat there playing princess." Helena bit her lip. She knew I was telling the truth, but she could not accept it. To her, I would always be the little sister who could never do anything right. Arthur returned with a brown leather briefcase. He set it on the table beside me and stepped back. "Miss Clara, will there be anything else?" "No." "Thank you," I said. Opening the briefcase and taking out a thick stack of documents, I looked out at the guests, most of whom were still standing in silence. A few had started whispering, but I did not let that distract me. "I have a few documents here," I said, lifting the folder so everyone could see it. "This is the purchase agreement for this estate, signed by me and the bank 3 months ago. These are the payment records for my parents' debts, totaling more than $400,000. And these are the receipts for this year's property taxes." I paused and looked straight at Helena. "Would you like to see them, Helena, so you can understand exactly how wrong you've been about me all these years?" Helena stood frozen, her face pale. She said nothing. She couldn't. My father, still sitting in his chair, finally spoke. His voice was weak, but clear enough to be heard in the silent room. "Clara, you did all of that for us." I went to his side and knelt down so I could look directly into his eyes. "Yes, Dad, I did it because I couldn't let our family lose this home. I did it because I love you." Tears began rolling down his face. He took my hand and squeezed it. "My girl, I'm sorry I didn't see it. I was too blind." Helena stepped forward, her voice sharp with anger. "Dad, you can't believe what she's saying. She abandoned us. She wasn't here when we needed her." "No," my father said, his voice frail but steadier than before. "You weren't here, Helena. You were here spending your mother's money and living like a princess. Clara was the one who was here when we truly needed someone." Helena stopped, like she had been slapped. My mother stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Clara, can you forgive me? I didn't know. I didn't understand." "Mother," I said, looking at her with a deep exhaustion I could no longer hide. "I have been here the whole time. I was here, solving everyone's problems. But none of you ever bothered to see me. I don't need your forgiveness. I need you to see me. Truly see me." For the first time in my life, my mother said nothing. She couldn't. I had told the truth, and the truth could not be brushed aside. I stood and looked around the room. The guests were still staring at me, but their expressions had changed. It was no longer pity or contempt. It was respect. "Tonight," I said, my voice echoing through the room, is my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, and I want us all to celebrate that. But I also want everyone here to know that this house was saved not by the people who lived in it and took it for granted, but by a woman who worked hard and refused to give up. I looked at Helena and my mother one last time. I'm not throwing anyone out tonight, but from now on, there will be new rules. If you want to live in this house, you will respect me. You will no longer treat me like I am beneath you, and you will remember that without me, this house would not exist anymore. Helena said nothing. She turned away and walked out of the room. My mother stood there with trembling hands, but she did not follow Helena. She stayed, facing the consequences of her actions for the first time in her life. I looked at the guests and smiled. Now, who would like more champagne? The evening is not over yet. The guests seemed to release a collective breath. Laughter and conversation slowly returned, and the room began to find its rhythm again. I stood there with the key pressed into my palm and felt a kind of peace I had never known before. For the first time in my life, I had stood up and taken my place back. I knew this would not end here. Helena would come back. She always did. But I would never again be that quiet. Insignificant little sister. Arthur came to my side and whispered, "Miss Clara, I am very proud of you." I looked at him and smiled. "Thank you. Arthur, I couldn't have done this without you." He nodded and walked away, leaving me there to look at the house that had once been my pain and had now become my victory. Later, I stepped onto the front porch, where I could see the garden under the moonlight. A soft breeze moved through the air, carrying the scent of flowers from the rose beds my mother had tended for years. I stood there, breathed in the cool night air, and felt like I was finally free. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the mansion's tall windows, waking me from the deepest sleep I had had in years. I lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet of the house, and felt a strange kind of peace. It was the first time I had slept in that room since I left years ago. Everything was exactly as I remembered: the carved wooden bed, the floral wallpaper, the faint scent of beeswax from the old candles. But now, everything was different. I was no longer an unwelcome guest. I was the owner. A soft knock came at the door. "Miss Clara, I've prepared breakfast." Arthur's voice called from the other side. "Thank you." "Arthur, I'll be down in a minute." I put on a simple dress and walked downstairs. The breakfast room was flooded with morning light, and Arthur had set the table with toast, fresh fruit, and a pot of hot coffee. I sat down and looked out at the garden through the window. Everything seemed more peaceful when I did not have to worry about Helena, but I knew that peace would not last forever. Helena was not someone who gave up easily. She had lost control, and she would do anything to get it back. I had seen it in her eyes the night before that defeat. That anger and that cold spark I knew too well. As I was eating breakfast, I heard hurried footsteps coming down the hall. Helena appeared in the doorway, her face tight and her eyes full of resentment. My mother stood behind her, looking anxious and confused. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm as if nothing had happened. "The coffee is still hot. Please, sit down." Helena did not sit. She stood there with her hands on her hips, staring at me with open defiance. "Do you think you can just come here and take everything? Clara, do you think you can throw us out of our own home? This is not your home," I said, still calm. "It is mine. I bought it, and I paid for it. If you want to stay, you will live by my rules." Helena laughed, but it was fake and strained. "You can't do that. You can't just walk in here and change everything. Dad said this house would be mine. He promised me." "Dad may have promised that," I said, setting my coffee cup down, "but Dad did not own it anymore. The bank did. And I saved it. That means I am the only one with the right to decide what happens to it. My mother stepped forward, her voice pleading. Clara, please don't do this. We're family. We can find a peaceful way to handle this. Mother, I said, looking at her with exhaustion. I tried to handle things peacefully for years. I stayed quiet when Helena treated me like a servant. I stayed quiet when you nodded along with everything she said. I am done with that now. Helena moved closer, her voice turning sharp and cold. If you think you can throw us out of here, you're wrong. I'll sue you. I'll take this to court. I'll prove that you manipulated Dad when he was too sick to make decisions. I was not afraid. I had prepared for this. I had known Helena would try to use legal threats against me. And I was ready. You can try, I said, standing from the table. But before you do, I suggest you speak to your attorney. I have every document I need. I have the purchase agreement, the payment receipts, and Dad's statement confirming he agreed to the sale. You will not win. Helena stood there, pale-faced. She could not believe I had been that prepared. You thought about all of this? My mother asked, her voice full of disbelief. I thought about everything. I said, I spent years preparing. I knew one day I would have to stand up and protect myself. And I am ready. Helena walked out of the room without another word. My mother stood there, confused and frightened. Watching her go. Mother, I said, my voice softening. I don't want to hurt you. I just want you to see the truth. Helena is not who you think she is. She has been using you and Dad for years. And I was there, seeing all of it. But I couldn't do anything because I was too afraid to speak. My mother looked at me with tear-filled eyes. I didn't know. I didn't see what Helena was doing. I thought she was taking care of us. Mother, I said, taking her hand. Helena wasn't taking care of anyone but herself. I was taking care of you and Dad. I did it quietly. And now I can't stay quiet anymore. My mother pulled me into her arms and began to cry. For the first time in my life. She truly saw me, my darling. I'm sorry. I wasn't there for you. I was too focused on Helena and what she wanted. I held her and felt one part of the wound begin to heal. I love you, Mother, and I will always be here for you. But from now on, there will be boundaries. After that, I called a family meeting. I wanted everyone to understand the situation and decide whether they wanted to continue living there. My mother agreed to stay. My father had already agreed long ago. But Helena refused. She said she could not live under the same roof as me. And she would find somewhere else to live. That was her choice. And I respected it. But I knew she would not leave easily. A few days later, I received a call from Helena's attorney. She had threatened to take the matter to court. But I was ready. I had given my own attorney every document. And I instructed them to inform Helena that if she moved forward with the lawsuit, she would be responsible for the legal costs. Helena finally backed down. She realized she could not win, and that pushing further would only make everything worse. A few weeks later, Helena moved out of the mansion. She moved into a small apartment downtown, where she had to start over from scratch. My mother tried to convince her to stay, but Helena was too proud to admit she had been wrong. I stayed at the mansion with my parents and began a new life of my own. I started working remotely, managing my business, and enjoying the quiet peace of the house. One day, I was standing in the garden, looking out over the rose beds, when my mother came to stand beside me. My darling, she said. I spoke with Helena. She wants to see you and apologize. I turned to look at her, feeling a faint surprise. She actually wants to apologize, I think so. My mother said. I think she's starting to understand what she did. I did not know if I was ready to see Helena yet, but I knew I could not avoid her forever. Eventually, I agreed to meet her at a cafe downtown. When I walked in, Helena was sitting in a corner, looking smaller and weaker than I had ever seen her. She was not wearing jewelry or expensive clothes. She looked like a woman who had lost everything. "Thank you for coming," Helena said, her voice soft and stripped of arrogance. "You don't have to thank me," I said, sitting across from her. "I just want to know what you wanted to say." Helena looked down at the table, her fingers trembling. "Clara, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything I did. I'm sorry for treating you like a servant. I'm sorry for saying those awful things to you. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you." I looked at her, and I could see the truth in her eyes. She really was sorry. "Helena," I said, "I can forgive you, but I can't forget what happened. I can't forget how you treated me for years." Helena nodded. "I understand. I don't expect you to forget, but I hope you can give me a chance to change." I sat there, looking at her, and felt a small spark of hope. Maybe things could finally change. Maybe Helena really could become a better person. "We can try," I said, "but it's going to take a long time to rebuild trust." Helena smiled. "Weak but genuine. I'll do whatever it takes to earn it back." Over the next few weeks, Helena slowly began showing up in my life again, but with a completely different attitude. She no longer criticized me or put me down. She started asking about my work, about the projects I was building, and even asked for my advice. At first, I was suspicious, but over time, I started to see that she was genuinely trying to change. One day, Helena came to the mansion carrying a box of homemade pastries. "I made these for you," she said, sounding a little embarrassed. "I know you like chocolate cake." I looked at her, and I could see it was a sincere effort. "Thank you," I said, smiling. "I'll try them later." Helena nodded and sat down at the table. "I know I did a lot of things wrong. Clara, I lived under this illusion that I deserved everything without having to do anything to earn it. But now I understand that nothing is free, and no one owes me anything." I sat across from her and listened. I learned that happiness doesn't come from owning expensive things or being admired by other people. It comes from having honest relationships, from loving and being loved. I looked at her and saw that she really had changed. "Helena," I said, "I'm glad you realize that. I know change isn't easy, but I can see you're trying." Helena smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a real smile. "Thank you, Clara. Thank you for giving me a chance." I began to believe our relationship could be repaired. There were still scars from the past, but we were starting to build something new based on respect and truth. One evening, Helena and I sat in the garden, looking up at the stars. The air was peaceful, and I felt a connection with her I had never felt before. "Helena," I said, "I want you to know I'm proud of you. I know changing isn't easy, but you're doing it." Helena looked at me, her eyes brightening. "Thank you, Clara. And you know what, I'm proud of you too. You built an incredible life for yourself, and you did it without anyone's help." I smiled, feeling like our relationship had truly begun to heal. It would take time to trust completely, but I knew we were moving in the right direction. In the months that followed, my family slowly grew closer. My father became healthier. My mother seemed happier. And Helena became the kind of sister I could finally be proud of. I learned that forgiveness is a process, and sometimes it takes time to heal wounds that run deep. One late autumn afternoon, I was sitting in the mansion's library, reading through some of my father's old letters. When the doorbell rang, I heard Arthur's voice in the hallway, and then footsteps moving toward me. The door opened, and Helena walked in with an envelope in her hand. She looked more tense than usual. "Clara, can I talk to you for a minute?" I set the letter down and turned to look at her. "Of course." "What is it?" Helena stepped inside and sat in the chair across from me. She stared at the envelope for a long time, as if she were trying to decide whether to open it. "I received a letter from my attorney," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They informed me about the outcome of the case I threatened." I said nothing. I simply watched her and waited. Helena opened the envelope and pulled out a sheet of paper. She read it in silence, and I could see the color in her face shift from tension to shock. "They rejected my claim," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "The court said you have full legal rights to own this estate. They also said I could be responsible for your legal fees if I continue." I sat still and let her words settle. I had known this would happen. I had prepared for every possibility, but I did not want to look victorious. I only wanted her to understand that the time for fighting was over. "Helena," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "I don't want this war. I never did. I only wanted a family that loved and respected each other. And I think we can still have that if you are willing to let go of the past." Helena looked at me, and I could see tears begin to roll down her cheeks. "I don't know how to let go. Clara, I've spent my whole life fighting, grabbing, proving that I deserved things. But you hurt people along the way," I said, "and I think you need to learn how to live differently." Helena lowered her head, and I could see the deep pain inside her. "I hurt you most of all," she said, her voice breaking, "and I don't know how to fix that." I stood and walked over to her. I sat beside her and took her hand. "Helena," I said, "I can't forget what happened, but I can begin to trust you if you keep showing me that you've changed. That's all I need." Helena looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "I'll do that," she said. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserve your trust." In the months that followed, Helena truly changed. She found a real job, one where she had to work hard to support herself. She started saving money and paying off her debts. She stopped depending on our parents and began living an independent life. I watched that change happen day by day, and I started to believe she really had become different. One day, Helena came to the mansion and invited me to walk with her in the garden. We walked in silence for a while, enjoying the fresh air and the sunlight. "Clara," Helena said, "I want to thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for giving me another chance." I looked at her and smiled. "Helena, I've always believed people can change. I just need them to truly want to change. And I think you've proven that." Helena stopped and looked at me, her eyes full of gratitude. "I love you, Clara, and I promise I will never disappoint you again." I hugged her, and I felt warmth settle in my heart. We had come a long way from that terrible night at the party, from hatred and hurt. We had found a way back to each other, and I knew our relationship would never be perfect, but it would be real. And that was all I needed. A few months later, Helena announced she was getting married. She had met a kind man, an elementary school teacher who loved her for who she truly was. Not for her family or money. I was genuinely happy for her and helped her plan the wedding. It was a small, intimate ceremony held in the mansion's garden. All our friends and family were there, and everyone laughed and cried with happiness. When Helena walked down the aisle, I stood there with tears running down my face. I looked at her and saw a woman who had found peace and joy, and I knew I had played a part in helping her get there. After the wedding, Helena and her husband moved into a small house in the suburbs. She no longer lived in the mansion, but she was still part of the family. We saw each other often, and our relationship became one of the most precious things in my life. One spring evening, I was sitting on the porch, looking out over the garden, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I had moved through the pain and found peace. I had found my family again, not as it once was, but as it could become. I knew the road had not been easy, but it had been worth it. I had learned that love and forgiveness are choices, and I had chosen to love and forgive. 1 year after Helena's wedding, I was sitting in the mansion's library, writing in my journal about my journey. The late afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting warm streaks of gold across the rows of old books. My life had changed more than I could ever have imagined. I was no longer the quiet, frightened woman I had once been. I had found my voice, and I had learned how to use it. My business continued to grow. I expanded operations and created more jobs. But the most important thing to me was not the money or the success. It was the relationships I had rebuilt. My mother had become one of my closest companions. We gardened together, cooked together, and shared stories about the past. She had learned to see me as a grown woman, not just the little daughter who needed protecting. My father, though still physically weak, had become brighter in spirit. He often sat on the porch, reading and looking out over the garden. And every now and then he would tell me stories from his younger years with my mother. Helena and I had become closer than ever. She often visited on weekends with her husband and their little child. Watching her as a mother, I saw an entirely different side of her, gentle, patient, and loving without conditions. One day, while I was playing with my little niece in the garden, Helena came outside and sat beside me on the stone bench. "Clara," she said, her voice soft and thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, about everything I did to you. And I want you to know I can't put into words how grateful I am that you gave me a second chance." I looked at her and felt warmth settle in my heart. "Helena, we both learned painful lessons from our mistakes. What matters is that we found our way back to each other." Helena nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "I love you, Clara, and I will always be grateful for everything you did." I hugged her and felt a deep sense of peace. My family had been able to move through the hurt and find love and forgiveness. That was the greatest gift I could have received. A few months later, our mansion hosted another grand celebration for my parents' anniversary. This time, I stood before the crowd as the owner of the house and the person who had organized everything. But more than that, I stood there as a woman who had found her strength. I looked around the room and saw the familiar faces of family and friends. Helena stood beside her husband, holding their little child in her arms, smiling happily. My mother was talking with a few old friends, and my father was sitting in his favorite chair, watching everything with a warm smile. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I said, my voice carrying through the room. "This is a special night for my family, not only because we are honoring my parents' marriage, but because we have learned how to love and forgive one another. We have faced trials, and we have found our way back to each other. And that is what matters most." Everyone applauded, and I could see warmth in their eyes. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the room had fallen quiet, I stood on the front porch, looking out over the garden under the moonlight. I had come a long way from the woman who had been humiliated at the front door to the woman standing there as the owner of this house. I had learned that truth and courage can change everything, and I had learned that family love, when built on respect and trust, can heal even the deepest wounds. I thought about Helena, about my mother, about my father, and about everything we had survived. I no longer felt anger or resentment. I only felt gratitude. Gratitude for the chance to repair what had been broken and build a new future. I stepped back inside, closed the door, and felt the warmth of the house wrap around me. This was my home, and I would always protect it and the people I loved, and I would never again let anyone treat me like a servant. I was the owner of my own life. As I climbed the stairs to go to bed, I stopped in front of an old family photograph on the wall. It was a picture of Helena and me as children, standing side by side with bright smiles. I looked at it and smiled. We had found our way back to each other, not as the innocent children we once were, but as grown women who had learned how to love each other honestly. My life was not perfect, but it was real and meaningful. And that was all I could ask for. I turned off the light and walked into my room, feeling a deep peace. I knew challenges could still come, but I would always have my family and my own strength to carry me through. That is my story. A story of losing and finding, of forgiveness and love. And I hope it inspires someone else to find their own strength. In the end, I realized that a home is not just a building. It is where your family is, where love and forgiveness live. And I had finally found mine. Forgiveness, I learned that afternoon, is not a door someone else gets to open just because they finally feel sorry. It is more like restoring an old house after years of neglect. First you inspect the damage. Then you secure the walls. And only after that do you decide which rooms can be entered again. Helena's apology mattered, but it did not erase the years she had spent treating my silence as permission. My mother's tears mattered, but they did not change the deed. The receipts? Or the truth that I had carried this family when they were too proud to look down and see who was holding the floor beneath them. So I told Helena there would be conditions. No claim to the estate. No insults dressed as jokes. No private pressure through mother. No rewriting the past to make herself look harmless. If she wanted a place in my life again, she would have to earn it slowly, with ordinary honesty, paying her own bills, keeping her word, speaking to me with respect, even when no one was watching. Love could invite her back to the table one day, but accountability would decide where she sat. Scriptwriter Nguyen Van Chien.